The ocean does not shout before it kills. It waits. In the winter darkness of the North Atlantic, somewhere between Greenland and Iceland, a Soviet submarine moved like a shadow beneath a frozen sky. Inside her steel hull were men who believed they were on a routine patrol. Above them was an American fleet that believed it owned the ocean. Between them stood a misunderstanding so dangerous it nearly ignited the unthinkable. This is the story of K-306, the Soviet submarine that, for a few breathless hours, stood against all of America and almost changed the course of history forever. What happened beneath those waves was buried in classified archives, softened in diplomatic language, and reduced to footnotes in Cold War textbooks. But when we strip away the official phrasing and reconstruct the tension minute by minute, a terrifying truth emerges. The world came dangerously close to war, not because of ideology, not because of grand strategy, but because of steel, sonar, and human fear in the dark. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how fragile peace truly was, and how a single submarine became the epicenter of a geopolitical earthquake. The Cold War in the 1970s was a war of invisibility. Satellites watched from orbit. Radar stations scanned the skies. Nuclear missiles waited in silos. But the real front line lay underwater. The Atlantic Ocean was a chessboard, and submarines were the queens. Silent, lethal, unpredictable. The United States Navy had perfected the art of underwater dominance. Nuclear-powered submarines prowled the oceans with confidence, armed with ballistic missiles capable of erasing cities. Carrier groups projected power across continents. Anti-submarine warfare aircraft hunted relentlessly from above. To the American public, the seas were secure. But beneath that confidence lurked anxiety. Soviet submarines were getting better, faster, quieter, more aggressive. And K-306 was not just another patrol boat. She was a Project 671 RTM, known in NATO classification as a Victor-class submarine. Sleek for her time, nuclear-powered, designed specifically to hunt American submarines and shadow carrier groups. Her mission was not symbolic, it was strategic. She existed to penetrate the very shield America believed was impenetrable. In early 1983, NATO forces began large-scale naval exercises in the North Atlantic. Dozens of ships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, submarines. It was a show of strength, a message to Moscow that the Atlantic remained firmly under Western control. Moscow saw something else. They saw preparation. They saw rehearsals. They saw the potential prelude to a first strike. So K-306 was dispatched to observe, gather intelligence, and, if necessary, test the American response. Inside her hull, Captain Nikolai Averin carried the weight of doctrine and suspicion. Soviet commanders were taught to expect aggression. They were taught that NATO exercises could mask real attack preparations. Above all, they were taught never to be caught unaware. K-306 slipped beneath the thermal layers of the Atlantic and began her approach. Meanwhile, the US Navy was running anti-submarine drills with confidence. American sonar systems were among the most advanced in the world. Surface ships deployed towed arrays. Patrol aircraft dropped sonobuoys in precise grids. The Atlantic hummed with electronic vigilance. And yet, for hours, K-306 remained undetected. This was not because the Americans were careless. It was because the ocean is never simple. Temperature layers bend sound. Salinity distorts signals. Noise from shipping lanes creates phantom echoes. Underwater warfare is not clean. It is murky, ambiguous, filled with doubt. When an American destroyer finally registered an anomalous contact, it was faint, inconsistent, almost dismissible. But Cold War protocol left little room for dismissal. The contact was marked, tracked, reacquired, lost, found again. What followed was a tightening spiral. American vessels shifted formation. Helicopters lifted off decks. Sonar pings intensified. Each active pulse cut through the water like a searchlight in darkness. Inside K-306, those pings were deafening. Imagine sitting inside a metal cylinder hundreds of feet below the surface while explosive sound waves slam against your hull. Every ping is a reminder. You are found. Captain Averin had seconds to decide how to respond. Soviet doctrine emphasized evasion, but it also emphasized resolve. Retreat could signal weakness. Remaining too close could signal provocation. Above him, the U.S. Navy interpreted the submarine's maneuvers as aggressive shadowing. Below, Averin interpreted the tightening American perimeter as preparation for engagement. Neither side wanted war. Both sides were preparing for it. The tension escalated when American forces conducted simulated attack runs, depth charge exercises, torpedo tracking drills. To U.S. commanders, it was training. To the crew of K-306, it was indistinguishable from a prelude to destruction. In confined waters, amid rising acoustic chaos, something went wrong. An American frigate adjusted course sharply after losing contact. At the same time, K-306 altered depth and heading to avoid what her sonar interpreted as encirclement. Steel met steel in darkness. The collision was sudden, violent, and catastrophic. The impact ripped into the outer hull of the Soviet submarine. Inside, lights flickered. Men were thrown from their stations. Alarms screamed. For a few suspended seconds, the crew believed they were under attack. On the American ship, shock reverberated across decks. A collision with a submerged object was every captain's nightmare. Damage reports flooded the bridge. Was it an enemy strike? A torpedo malfunction? An accident? In Washington and Moscow, early reports were fragmentary and alarming. A Soviet nuclear submarine had collided with an American warship during a NATO exercise. In 1983, the same year, NATO would conduct Able Archer. The same year, Soviet leadership feared a surprise nuclear strike. The same year, misinterpretations nearly triggered retaliation. This incident was gasoline near flame. Inside K-306, the situation was critical. The outer hull had absorbed much of the impact, but damage assessments were incomplete. If the pressure hull had been breached at depth, flooding would have been swift and merciless. Captain Averin faced a decision with global consequences. Surface and risk immediate confrontation, or remain submerged and attempt silent withdrawal. Surfacing could be interpreted as a threat display. Remaining underwater could be interpreted as hostile intent. The Americans, meanwhile, were scrambling to classify the event. Anti-submarine units prepared for worst-case scenarios. If the Soviet sub believed it had been attacked, it might respond defensively, and a defensive maneuver by a nuclear-armed submarine could cascade into escalation within minutes. The world above continued as usual. People went to work, markets opened, news anchors discussed routine politics. None of them knew that beneath the Atlantic, two superpowers were balancing on a knife's edge. K-306 ultimately chose survival over symbolism. She withdrew. damaged but afloat, silent but shaken. The American fleet stabilized. No weapons were launched. No retaliatory strikes were ordered. But intelligence agencies on both sides understood how close the margin had been. Not close in the cinematic sense, close in the bureaucratic procedural sense. The kind where one misunderstood sonar echo, one misread maneuver, one nervous officer could have initiated a chain of irreversible commands. K-306 returned to port scarred but intact. Official statements minimized the severity. Diplomatic channels smoothed tensions. Public narratives framed it as an unfortunate accident during routine operations. But inside naval circles, the lesson was unmistakable. The ocean does not forgive assumption. And the Cold War was not only fought in missile silos or political speeches. It was fought in moments like this, in darkness, under pressure, where fear travels faster than sound. K-306 did not fire a torpedo. She did not launch a missile. Yet for a brief and terrifying window, she stood against the might of the United States Navy, not in battle, but in proximity, in misunderstanding, in the fragile space between detection and destruction. That is how World War III almost begins. Not with declarations, but with a ping in the dark. In the end, both nations stepped back, not because they trusted each other, but because they feared what would follow if they did not. K-306 became a footnote, but the lesson endures. Peace during the Cold War was not the absence of danger. It was the mastery of restraint. And sometimes, restraint is all that stands between steel in the ocean and fire in the sky. The Atlantic was never empty, even when it appeared calm on satellite images, even when no periscope broke the surface, even when no headlines hinted at crisis. It was crowded with intent. By the time K-306 entered the patrol zone, both superpowers had turned the North Atlantic into a layered battlefield of sensors, patrol patterns, acoustic traps, and strategic paranoia. The Soviet Navy did not send her blindly. For weeks, intelligence analysts in Moscow had studied NATO maritime exercise schedules. Signals traffic increased. Carrier strike groups assembled. Maritime patrol aircraft redeployed to forward bases in Iceland and the United Kingdom. On paper, it was a standard demonstration of readiness. But in 1983, nothing felt standard. Earlier that year, political rhetoric between Washington and Moscow had hardened dramatically. American military modernization was accelerating. The Strategic Defense Initiative had been announced. NATO's deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe was underway. Soviet leadership, aging and deeply suspicious, interpreted each Western move through the lens of encirclement. To them, large-scale naval exercises were not just drills. They were rehearsals. K-306's orders were precise. Penetrate the exercise perimeter, identify carrier positions, collect acoustic signatures of new American vessels, and test response times of anti-submarine forces. She was to avoid provocation, avoid detection if possible, and above all, avoid escalation. But avoiding escalation requires both sides to interpret events the same way. And that was never guaranteed. The Victor-class submarine was designed for pursuit. Unlike ballistic missile submarines, which hid in bastions and deterrence patrol areas, attack submarines like K-306 were hunters. They tracked, they listened, they shadowed. Her nuclear reactor allowed sustained high speed beneath the surface. Her sonar suite was advanced by Soviet standards, though still noisier than American counterparts. She carried torpedoes capable of sinking aircraft carriers, and, depending on configuration, potentially nuclear-tipped weapons. That last detail mattered, because American naval commanders did not know at any given moment which Soviet submarine carried conventional torpedoes and which carried nuclear ones. Ambiguity was part of the deterrent strategy. As K-306 approached the outer screen of NATO vessels, she reduced speed to minimize acoustic signature. Machinery noise was dampened. Non-essential movement inside the submarine was restricted. Even small impacts, a dropped wrench, a slammed hatch, could travel through water as telltale vibrations. Inside the control room, the atmosphere tightened. Sonar operators worked in near darkness, illuminated only by instrument panels glowing green and amber. Every sound was catalogued: propeller blade rates, turbine harmonics, distant merchant shipping, biological noise. Above them, American destroyers formed a protective ring around the carrier group. The U.S. Navy had spent decades perfecting anti-submarine warfare. Towed array sonar systems trailed hundreds of meters behind ships, listening for subtle acoustic anomalies. Helicopters equipped with dipping sonar hovered low over the sea, lowering sensors into the depths. P-3 Orion aircraft flew grid patterns, dropping sonobuoys that created temporary listening networks. The Atlantic became a web. K-306 slipped through one strand. The first detection was almost dismissed. An American sonar technician aboard a guided missile destroyer noticed a faint, intermittent contact. It did not match known commercial traffic. It was too deep to be a surface vessel echo, too steady to be marine life. He reported it. The officer on watch requested reclassification. For several tense minutes, the contact flickered in and out of acoustic range. Then it strengthened. The destroyer adjusted course slightly, attempting to triangulate. On K-306, the sonar operator detected the course change immediately. The American ship's propeller frequency shifted subtly, indicating a turn. Captain Avron understood what that meant. They had been heard. He ordered a controlled descent, seeking a deeper thermal layer. In the ocean, temperature gradients bend sound waves. A submarine beneath a strong thermocline can effectively hide in acoustic shadow zones. It was a calculated move, but the Americans anticipated it. A helicopter lifted from the destroyer's deck, rotors slicing cold air. Within minutes, it reached the approximate contact area and lowered its dipping sonar. The first active ping pulsed downward. Inside K-306, the sound was like a hammer striking the hull. Active sonar is not subtle. It is an acoustic explosion. A deliberate declaration. We are searching for you. Avron faced a critical interpretation problem. Was this routine training escalation, or were they being deliberately hunted? Soviet doctrine emphasized that NATO might use exercises as cover for aggressive anti-submarine sweeps designed to degrade Soviet strategic capabilities before a first strike. If that were true, then allowing themselves to be cornered would be strategically negligent. He ordered a speed increase. Not full, just enough to alter position before the next ping. But increased speed increased noise, and increased noise increased certainty. Within minutes, multiple American units were tracking the contact. Sonobuoys splashed into the sea in widening arcs. Each buoy transmitted acoustic data back to aircraft and ships, forming a composite picture. On American command decks, tension replaced curiosity. This was no drifting anomaly. This was a submarine maneuvering deliberately within a NATO exercise zone. The rules of engagement were clear: track, identify, deter. Do not fire unless fired upon, but demonstrate dominance. Depth charges loaded for exercises were configured with minimal explosive yield, designed to signal, not destroy. In previous confrontations, such signaling charges had been used to warn Soviet submarines away from restricted zones. From the American perspective, this was calibrated pressure. From inside K-306, it was indistinguishable from hostile preparation. When the first practice depth charge detonated at a distance, the shock wave rippled through the water. Inside the submarine, gauges trembled. Dust shook loose from pipe seams. Crew members exchanged brief, controlled glances. No one panicked, but everyone understood the message. We know you are here. Leave. Averin did not immediately withdraw. His mission required data. The closer he remained to the carrier group, the more valuable the acoustic signatures he could collect. Each American vessel had a unique sonic fingerprint. Capturing those patterns could give the Soviet Navy long-term strategic advantages. He calculated risk versus intelligence gain. Above him, American commanders interpreted the Soviet submarine's persistence as defiance. Additional depth charges were deployed. Still low yield, still technically non-lethal, but closer now. In Washington, the Sixth Fleet relayed updates through secure channels. The presence of a Soviet attack submarine within exercise proximity was concerning but not unprecedented. However, the broader political climate amplified every decision. The same year had already seen false alarms in early warning systems. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces were locked in psychological escalation. Trust was thin. At one point, an American anti-submarine helicopter reported a fleeting sonar return, suggesting that the submarine might be preparing to ascend. That single misinterpretation triggered a cascade of internal communications. If the Soviet sub surfaced aggressively near a carrier group, it could be perceived as a provocation, or even a precursor to torpedo positioning. American commanders elevated readiness status. On K-306, the crew detected increased propeller noise from multiple converging vessels. Encirclement. Averin understood the geometry. If he continued at current depth and course, he risked being boxed into a narrowing corridor. If he ascended too quickly, he could appear to be charging toward surface units. If he dove deeper, he risked operating near structural depth limits, especially under pursuit. He chose lateral evasion, a hard turn at increased speed. The maneuver momentarily disrupted American tracking solutions. Sonar contacts blurred. For several seconds, K-306 slipped into partial acoustic shadow. But the ocean is not forgiving at speed. An American frigate, adjusting to maintain sonar angle, executed its own course correction. Neither crew could see the other. Visibility underwater is nearly zero at operational depth. Everything depends on interpretation of sound. Two steel bodies, each weighing thousands of tons, moved toward converging vectors without visual confirmation. On the American bridge, officers believed the submarine was turning away. Inside K-306, sonar indicated a gap in the encirclement, a possible escape lane. They accelerated into it, and then came the impact. The collision was not a cinematic explosion. It was a violent grinding, a thunderous metallic scream reverberating through both vessels. On K-306, men were thrown against bulkheads. Instruments sparked. One compartment reported minor flooding between hull layers. Emergency lighting activated instantly. On the American frigate, the shock jolted the entire frame. Sailors grabbed railings as alarms blared. Damage control teams rushed below decks to inspect hull integrity. For several seconds, both sides believed the worst. Had a torpedo detonated? Had weapons been launched? Had this become war? The absence of secondary explosions was the only reassurance. In Moscow, preliminary reports described physical contact with hostile NATO vessel during high-tension maneuver. The wording alone was dangerous. In Washington, the term collision with submerged Soviet submarine during exercise carried its own implications. Military hotlines remained quiet, but intelligence analysts worked furiously. K-306 assessed her damage. The outer hull bore the brunt of the collision. The pressure hull appeared intact, but structural stress readings were elevated. Remaining at depth under pursuit was increasingly risky. Averin made the most consequential decision of his career. He ordered controlled withdrawal at reduced speed, minimizing further acoustic provocation. He did not surface. He did not signal. He chose invisibility. The American fleet, after confirming no immediate hostile action, shifted from aggressive tracking to containment. Orders emphasized de-escalation. The priority became documentation, not retaliation. For hours afterward, NATO vessels maintained cautious distance while ensuring the Soviet submarine moved away from the carrier group. No torpedoes were armed, no missiles were prepared. But contingency plans were reviewed at every command level, because everyone understood something profound. If either captain had interpreted the collision as deliberate attack, if either side had reacted reflexively, the response chain could have accelerated beyond recall. Submarine warfare operates on compressed timelines. A perceived hostile act can trigger countermeasures within minutes. In 1983, both superpowers had standing procedures allowing rapid escalation under ambiguous threat conditions. The fact that restraint prevailed was not inevitable. It was human. Later analysis would reveal how thin the margin had been. Acoustic misreads, aggressive training patterns, political mistrust amplifying tactical uncertainty. K-306 limped home weeks later. Repairs were conducted discreetly. Official Soviet accounts minimized the confrontation. American statements described it as a navigational accident during routine operations. But within classified circles, the event became a case study. Not of aggression, but of proximity. Because the most dangerous moments of the Cold War were not missile launches. They were collisions of interpretation, steel striking steel in darkness. And in that darkness, for a brief and terrifying interval, K-306 had stood inside the defensive perimeter of the United States Navy, surrounded, pressured, and seconds away from a chain reaction that could have rewritten history. The ocean closed over the incident, but it did not erase it, and the men who were there never forgot how close the world had come. Not to intentional war, but to accidental catastrophe born from fear and sound. Above the surface, the ocean returned to its indifferent rhythm. Waves rolled. Radar dishes rotated. Jet fuel burned in the engines of patrol aircraft that had no idea how close the exercise had drifted toward catastrophe. Officially, nothing extraordinary had happened. A minor collision. A navigational incident. A routine interaction. But inside secure rooms in Washington and Moscow, the language was very different. In the Pentagon, analysts reconstructed the event frame by frame. Acoustic logs were replayed repeatedly. Sonar recordings were slowed, filtered, dissected. Every ping, every change in propeller rhythm, every abrupt maneuver was plotted onto digital maps. The question was not who was at fault. The question was how close the United States had come to firing the first shot of World War III without meaning to. Because that was the real danger of the Cold War at sea. Not deliberate aggression, misinterpretation. In 1983, the geopolitical climate was already electrified. Just months earlier, Soviet air defenses had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, believing it to be a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. The world had recoiled in horror. Trust between East and West had thinned to almost nothing. Then came NATO's Able Archer exercise later that year, a command post drill simulating nuclear escalation. Soviet intelligence misread it as possible preparation for a real strike. Nuclear forces were quietly placed on heightened alert. It was in this atmosphere that K-306 moved beneath the Atlantic. When American naval commanders replayed the collision timeline, they noticed something chilling. At several key points, if slightly different decisions had been made, U.S. forces might have interpreted the Soviet submarines' maneuvers as torpedo positioning. Under standard Cold War doctrine, if a U.S. carrier group believed it was about to be attacked by a nuclear-capable submarine, response time was measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. Helicopters could drop live depth charges. Escort ships could fire anti-submarine rockets. Submarines in the area could release torpedoes, all legally justified under defensive rules of engagement. Inside the Soviet Navy's command structure, a similar analysis unfolded. Captain Averin submitted a classified report detailing the sequence of events. He described the escalating sonar pressure, the depth charge detonations, the encirclement geometry. From his perspective, NATO forces had applied deliberate coercive tactics bordering on hostile engagement. He also admitted something rare in Soviet military paperwork. He acknowledged that his own evasive maneuver had contributed to the collision. That admission likely prevented harsher internal consequences, because Soviet leadership had its own nightmare scenario to confront. What if the collision had damaged the reactor compartment? Victor-class submarines were nuclear-powered. A severe hull breach at depth could have led not only to crew loss, but to radioactive contamination in the Atlantic. In a crisis atmosphere, such an event could have been interpreted as sabotage or attack. Worse still, some Victor-class submarines carried torpedoes with nuclear warheads. If one had detonated accidentally during impact, the result would have been catastrophic, not just tactically, but politically. Nuclear detonation underwater near a NATO fleet during heightened tensions would have been indistinguishable from a deliberate strike. The retaliation protocols were already written. This was the terrifying truth buried beneath the official reports. It was not simply a collision. It was a convergence of nuclear-armed systems operating under mutual suspicion in confined space. And the only reason the world did not cross the line was because no one panicked. But panic was never far away. American sailors who were present later described the shock on deck. The initial fear was not of sinking. It was of escalation. One officer recalled thinking, in the seconds after impact, if they think we rammed them intentionally, they might fire. That fear was mutual. Inside K-306, several crew members initially believed they had been struck by a torpedo. The vibration profile was violent, metallic, explosive. Emergency procedures were initiated before confirmation of collision was established. Had any officer misread a sonar echo in those chaotic seconds as an incoming weapon, countermeasures could have followed. In submarine warfare, ambiguity is deadly. Sound does not carry context. A ping is just a ping. A vibration is just a vibration. Meaning is assigned by human interpretation, and humans, under stress, can be wrong. After the incident, quiet diplomatic channels activated. There were no public condemnations, no dramatic speeches. But behind closed doors, naval attachés exchanged information. Both sides subtly reassured the other that no hostile intent had existed. The tone was careful, measured, because both governments understood that their militaries had come dangerously close to an irreversible spiral. Within NATO, the incident triggered internal reviews of anti-submarine signaling practices. The use of practice depth charges, while technically non-lethal, was re-evaluated in terms of psychological impact. From the American perspective, signaling deterrence made sense. From the Soviet perspective, it felt like attack rehearsal. The difference between those interpretations was the space where war almost lived. In Moscow, the Politburo received a summary briefing. By 1983, the Soviet leadership was deeply concerned about perceived American technological superiority at sea. The U.S. Navy's quieting technologies, advanced sonar, and global basing network gave it enormous reach. But incidents like this also proved something else. Soviet submarines could penetrate NATO exercises. They could reach carrier groups. They could survive encirclement. That fact carried strategic weight. Deterrence is built not only on weapons, but on demonstrated capability. K-306 had shown that American dominance was not absolute. At the same time, American Naval Command concluded something equally important. Their anti-submarine network worked. They had detected, tracked, pressured, and contained a Soviet submarine without firing a shot. Both sides walked away with narratives that supported their strategic confidence. And that may be why neither chose escalation, because escalation would have forced both to test assumptions under fire. The crew of K-306 returned to base under strict silence orders. Repairs were conducted in secured docks. External hull damage was patched. Internal systems were recalibrated. Official commendations were muted. No medals for collision. No public heroism. Just continuation. But privately, among the crew, the memory lingered. The metallic scream of impact. The seconds of uncertainty. The realization that history might pivot on misunderstood sound. Years later, after the Cold War ended and archives slowly opened, historians began piecing together how many such moments had occurred. Submarines colliding, aircraft straying into airspace, radar systems malfunctioning, false missile alerts. The Cold War was not a stable standoff. It was a chain of near misses. K-306 became one link in that chain. Not the most famous, not the most documented, but emblematic, because it illustrated something fundamental about nuclear deterrence. The theory assumes rational actors with full information. Reality offers stressed humans with partial data. The ocean magnifies that uncertainty. Darkness, pressure, noise distortion, limited communication. Inside a submarine, you cannot see your adversary. You infer them. You imagine their intentions. An imagination under political tension is rarely generous. The United States and the Soviet Union never fought a direct naval war during the Cold War. That absence is often cited as proof that deterrence worked perfectly. But events like the K-306 incident reveal a different truth. Deterrence worked because time and again, individuals chose restraint under incomplete understanding, because captains hesitated, because officers double-checked sonar readings, because political leaders resisted worst-case assumptions. In the months following the collision, global tensions would spike again. NATO's Able Archer exercise would alarm Soviet intelligence. Soviet early warning systems would briefly misidentify sunlight reflections as incoming missiles in September 1983, only to be correctly dismissed by Officer Stanislav Petrov. Each event shared a pattern: ambiguous signal, potential catastrophic interpretation, human restraint. K-306's story fits into that pattern precisely. It was not the loudest crisis, but it was one of the quiet ones that mattered. Because had that collision escalated, historians might now describe 1983 as the year the Cold War turned hot. Instead, it became another hidden fracture, sealed by secrecy. For the United States, the lesson reinforced investment in anti-submarine warfare modernization. Quieter submarines, better sensors, clearer engagement rules. For the Soviet Union, it reinforced the need for stealth improvements and cautious tactical doctrine in close proximity operations. Ironically, both sides improved their capabilities in ways that reduced accidental confrontation. Technology advanced, procedures evolved, and slowly, the Cold War thawed. By the late 1980s, arms control negotiations gained momentum. The INF Treaty reduced intermediate-range nuclear missiles. Naval encounters became less aggressive. Confidence-building measures were introduced to prevent dangerous misunderstandings at sea. But those developments came after years of risk. After submarines like K-306 operated in silence beneath geopolitical storms. When we look back now, it is tempting to frame the Cold War as a calculated chess match between rational superpowers. But chess assumes visible pieces. Underwater, there were none, only echoes. The men aboard K-306 were not ideologues. They were sailors, young conscripts and seasoned officers performing assigned duties. The American sailors they encountered were no different. None of them wanted to start World War III. Yet all of them were positioned within systems that could have done so accidentally. That is the paradox. Peace was maintained not because danger was absent, but because danger was constant. Constant enough to demand caution, constant enough to instill fear. And sometimes, fear prevents recklessness. The Atlantic eventually forgot the sound of that collision. Salt water corrodes evidence. Time dissolves urgency. But the lesson remains submerged in strategic memory. When two nuclear-armed powers operate in proximity, especially in environments where perception depends on imperfect signals, escalation is never far away. K-306 did not fire a weapon. She did not declare war. But for several tense hours, she existed at the center of a potential cascade, surrounded by American warships, under acoustic assault, damaged, uncertain, nuclear capable, against all of America. And the only thing that prevented catastrophe was a series of restrained decisions made in darkness. That is not a comforting conclusion. It is a sobering one, because it reminds us that history often balances not on grand speeches or summit agreements, but on quiet moments when individuals choose not to pull a trigger they are authorized to pull. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. Many of the submarines that once prowled the Atlantic now rust in reserve fleets or have been dismantled. But nuclear submarines still patrol the depths today. They still listen. They still operate in silence. And somewhere, right now, sonar operators are interpreting faint contacts in dark water. The world depends on them interpreting correctly, because the ocean still does not shout before it kills. It waits, and history has shown how thin the margin can be between routine maneuver and irreversible war. K-306 was one of those margins, a shadow beneath the Atlantic that almost became a spark in the sky. And the fact that it did not is not proof of invulnerability. It is proof of how close humanity once came, and how carefully it must continue to move. In the silent theater beneath the waves. Years passed before the full weight of what happened beneath the Atlantic began to surface. Not in headlines, not in official commemorations, but in declassified fragments, interviews with aging officers, and quiet acknowledgements buried in naval archives. K-306 became a ghost story inside professional military circles. The kind told not to frighten, but to warn. Because what made the incident so dangerous was not aggression, it was normalcy. Everything that happened that day fell within standard Cold War behavior. NATO conducted exercises. The Soviet Navy monitored them. American forces used signaling depth charges. Soviet submarines maneuvered evasively. Every action followed doctrine, and yet doctrine, when mirrored by suspicion, becomes combustible. Inside the U.S. Navy War College, the collision was eventually studied as a case in escalation management. Officers dissected the decision-making chain with uncomfortable honesty. Why were signaling charges deployed at that proximity? Why did communication channels remain indirect instead of immediate? At what point does deterrent signaling begin to resemble provocation? These were not theoretical questions. They were operational ones, because the Atlantic in 1983 was not just water. It was a compressed geopolitical space where technology outpaced trust. American naval superiority at the time was real. The U.S. fleet was larger, more technologically advanced, and globally deployed. Carrier groups projected power across oceans. Submarines like the Los Angeles class were becoming quieter and deadlier. But superiority carries its own risk. Confidence can reduce caution. From the American perspective, Soviet submarines entering exercise zones were expected. It was a demonstration of transparency. Both sides knew the other would observe. But the Soviet leadership did not interpret NATO exercises through the same lens. In Moscow, strategic paranoia was not irrational. It was historical. The Soviet Union had been invaded twice in the 20th century at catastrophic cost. Military doctrine evolved around preemption awareness and defensive vigilance. By 1983, Soviet leaders were aging, isolated, and deeply distrustful of Western intentions. Intelligence assessments frequently emphasized worst-case scenarios. In that psychological climate, a NATO fleet practicing coordinated anti-submarine warfare looked less like training and more like rehearsal for neutralizing Soviet deterrent forces. That perception traveled down the chain of command. When Captain Averin felt his submarine encircled by active sonar and depth charges, he was not merely interpreting acoustic data. He was interpreting geopolitical tension. An interpretation is shaped by context. American sailors, on the other hand, were operating under their own narrative, that of maintaining sea control against increasingly capable Soviet submarines. From their perspective, assertive tracking prevented surprise. Controlled signaling prevented ambiguity. Two doctrines, two strategic cultures, one ocean. After the incident, both sides quietly adjusted procedures. NATO refined guidelines regarding proximity during exercises. Greater emphasis was placed on predictable maneuver patterns when shadowed by foreign submarines. Communication channels, though still limited, were reviewed for faster crisis clarification. The Soviet Navy also revised aspects of its close contact tactics. Greater caution was advised when operating within dense NATO formations. Emphasis was placed on avoiding aggressive lateral maneuvers under pressure unless absolutely necessary. These adjustments were subtle, but they mattered, because the Cold War did not end due to a single dramatic breakthrough. It ended through accumulation of lessons, near misses, realizations. K-306 contributed to that accumulation. What makes this chapter of history especially chilling is how invisible it remained to the public. In 1983, citizens in both countries consumed news shaped by ideology. They heard about missile deployments and diplomatic tensions. They saw political speeches. They did not hear about the grinding collision of nuclear-powered vessels hundreds of feet beneath the Atlantic. Had the event escalated, public awareness would have been instant and catastrophic. Instead, silence prevailed. And silence can be deceptive, because it creates the illusion that nothing dangerous occurred. In reality, the Cold War was filled with submerged crises, incidents resolved quietly precisely because leaders feared their consequences. Consider how easily the K-306 event could have intersected with other 1983 flashpoints. If it had occurred during the peak of Able Archer tensions, Soviet leadership might have interpreted it as coordinated aggression. If it had followed immediately after the K-007 shootdown, Western publics might have demanded retaliation. If damage had been worse, if casualties had occurred, domestic pressure could have forced political hardening. History is sensitive to timing. K-306 collided at a moment when fear was high, but not yet uncontrollable. That timing may have saved millions. There is another dimension often overlooked. Technology was improving rapidly, but communication between adversaries remained deliberately constrained. Direct naval-to-naval crisis hotlines were limited. On-scene commanders had to interpret intent without immediate diplomatic clarification. Today, military forces often have structured deconfliction channels. In 1983, such mechanisms were minimal and burdened by mistrust. This meant that the burden of preventing escalation rested heavily on individual judgment. An individual judgment under stress is unpredictable. The American captain who chose not to interpret the collision as deliberate aggression made a decision that cannot be fully quantified. The Soviet captain who chose withdrawal rather than retaliatory posture made another. Neither decision was heroic in the cinematic sense. They were professional, measured, restrained. But restraint is often the quiet hero of history. Years later, as Cold War tensions thawed, former adversaries would occasionally meet at international naval symposiums. Retired officers who once tracked each other across oceans would exchange stories over coffee. Some of those conversations reportedly touched on incidents like K-306. There was no bitterness, mostly recognition. Recognition that both sides operated under pressure, that both sides feared surprise attack, that both sides carried nuclear responsibility heavier than most civilians could imagine. One American officer reportedly summarized it best during a closed seminar in the 1990s. "We were all professionals trying not to be the ones who made the mistake." That sentence captures the fragile equilibrium of the Cold War more accurately than any missile count. The K-306 incident did not trigger treaties. It did not produce immediate reforms, but it reinforced a truth that strategic planners gradually internalized. Proximity without communication multiplies risk. In subsequent years, confidence-building measures slowly expanded. Agreements on preventing incidents at sea were revisited and strengthened. Notification protocols improved. Each step was incremental. Each step was influenced by memories of how close things had come before. And yet, despite these improvements, the core reality remains unchanged. Submarines still operate in silence. Nuclear deterrence still depends on second strike capability. Ocean depths still distort sound, which means the essential risk persists. What has changed is the awareness of that risk. K-306 serves as a reminder that technological superiority does not eliminate danger, nor does numerical advantage, nor even good intentions. Danger arises from interaction under uncertainty, from mirrored suspicion, from doctrine colliding with doctrine. The Cold War ended not because danger disappeared, but because political transformation reshaped its context. But if we strip away ideology and focus purely on systems, we see something sobering. The same structural conditions that nearly caused catastrophe in 1983 still exist in different forms today. Advanced militaries operate in contested maritime zones. Submarines patrol beneath rival fleets. Exercises are conducted near strategic choke points. Sonar pings still echo in darkness. The difference between caution and catastrophe remains a matter of seconds and judgment. That is why K-306 matters. Not because it fired a weapon, not because it caused casualties, but because it revealed the thinness of the line. A line drawn not in treaties, but in choices. When historians evaluate the Cold War, they often focus on nuclear arsenals and ideological rivalry. But the deeper lesson lies in operational friction. Peace survived not because the system was stable, but because individuals within it repeatedly chose de-escalation. The ocean never announced how close it came to hosting the first direct naval battle between superpowers. It simply absorbed the noise. Steel scraped steel. Men steadied themselves in dark compartments. Commands were issued and countermanded. And then, gradually, distance replaced proximity. The Atlantic closed over the moment, but it left behind a lesson etched not in public memory, but in professional doctrine. When nuclear powers maneuver in silence, clarity must be manufactured deliberately, because the alternative is assumption, and assumption under pressure can kill faster than torpedoes. K-306 returned to history's shadows. Yet in those shadows lies one of the clearest warnings of the Cold War era. World War III was never only about missiles and silos. It was about submarines beneath fleets, about sonar contacts misread, about commanders choosing restraint while surrounded by armed certainty. The world did not notice when K-306 turned away, but history did. And history remembers how close silence came to becoming fire.